Okay, well, thanks, Ted, for the nice introduction, and thanks to the Science Unwrapped committee for inviting me to speak with you tonight. And as often people who speak in this venue do, they ask me to tell you a little bit about how I became a scientist. And to make a long story short, it was really by accident. I didn't intend to become a scientist. I didn't even know any scientists until I went to college. And I think part of the reason for that is that I had a mental model of what a scientist is. And who is this? Beaker, right. If you are a middle school girl or a high school girl, it's very unlikely that you will identify yourself as Beaker. And I certainly did not. But I went to college, originally planning to be a veterinarian, and eventually got involved in undergraduate research and learned that scientists can look like this. And not only do they look like females, but they actually get to go outside and do science. And I found that very attractive. So how many of you kids in the audience like to play in the mud? Or grown-ups in the audience? Woohoo! So the students and I, we get paid to play in the mud. And we basically study, as Ted mentioned, the physical, chemical, and biological processes that affect water quality in streams and rivers. And this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon exemplifies what we do when we go to the field. We say, hey, here's a trickle of water. I say our afternoon just got booked. So what I'm going to talk tonight about is processes that affect water quality in streams and rivers. And rivers are really important for people. Since the dawn of civilization, people have lived along the borders of rivers, such as here along the Seine in Paris. And that's because rivers do a lot of really important things that people take advantage of. Scientists call these things ecosystem services. Can anybody give me some examples of what a service that a river might provide? Transportation, yes. Look here, there's boats on the river transporting people and goods. How about some other ideas?
Drinking water.
Drinking water, exactly. Hydroelectricity. How about here in Utah? What do rivers use really for? Fish, well, sure, fishing.
Energy.
Recreation, energy. How about irrigation? Yeah, that's an important service too. So humans value rivers for these properties, but some of the things that people do with or to water become something called an ecosystem disservice, both to people and the environment. And probably the best example of this is what we do with our wastewater. And this photo is a really extreme example of the disservice of discharging waste into streams and rivers. It's a boy going into an outhouse in Bangladesh, and what do you think happens when he flushes the potty? Well, it's not even a real potty. It just goes right into the river. And poor sanitation is a really big problem worldwide. About 2.8 billion people don't have access to wastewater treatment. And improper sanitation of water is one of the greatest killers of children worldwide. About every 15 minutes, a child dies from diarrhea. I like to talk about poo, too. And 90% of those diarrhea cases are caused by fecal contamination, either in water or in food. So in the developing world, this is a huge problem, but it's not unique to the developing world, as this can happen in the developed world too. For example, about 100 people died several years ago because of a cryptosporidium outbreak in Lake Michigan, and that also left about 400,000 people sick. So it happens here as well. Not only is wastewater discharged to freshwater bodies a disservice to humans that rely on that water for drinking or cleaning or food, it also makes streams and rivers sick as well. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that tonight. But before I do, I'd like to get 2 volunteers to come up to the board. How about you two right here? Not my child. And what I want you guys to do is take a pen. What are your names?
Abby and Conrad.
Abby and Conrad. Nice to meet you. Okay. You folks in the audience, if you have paper, you can do this too, or you can just keep it in your head of what I'm going to ask these kids to do. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to draw what you think a river looks like. Ready? Get it on your marks. Get set. Go. Perfect. Thank you. How many of you had a model in your head that looks like this? Woo! When I do this exercise in classes, that's often what people draw. So excellent work. Thank you so much. You can go back to your seats now. Oh, and thank you for erasing. Woo! Okay, so most folks will have this mental model that looks like this. And I think it's because of how we relate to streams and rivers. If we're children playing along a river's banks and we throw sticks into it, or if we're in Bangladesh and we dump our wastewater into it, it travels downstream, so it's out of sight, out of mind. But from the air, rivers look like this, a network of meandering channels that run through the earth. And from this view, you can see how rivers are intimately connected to the landscapes that they drain. So what does this mean for how rivers work? Well, it means that what happens up in the catchment or up in the watershed has important consequences for those who live downstream. And this is a picture of the Colorado River Delta in Mexico. And it's showing you something really important about what is going on in the upper watershed, for example, here in Utah. The river is dry, and it no longer flows to the sea. A recent paper suggested that 80% of the world's population live in a situation where water scarcity, water pollution, and loss of biodiversity make it such that they are imperiled by water availability. And one of the important stressors that we focus on in my lab is nutrient pollution. And this is an important problem here in the US and around the world. And this is a picture showing you the Mississippi River Delta, which receives a lot of nutrients from fertilizer runoff and also from combined sewer overflows. And those nutrients are discharged into the Gulf of Mexico and cause algal blooms that look like this. And what happens when those algae die is they decompose and consume the oxygen, causing fish kills. About half of the streams and rivers in the United States are impacted by multiple stressors, including nutrients. And I like to call nutrients the underbelly of global change. We hear a lot about climate change, especially given the warm fall that we've been having here in North America. But nutrients are also an important problem. And this picture is coming from China along the bay where they were having the skull competition in the Olympics in 2008. And very high nitrogen concentrations in this lake caused this algal bloom. And so people rallied together to try to clean it up before the races began. So some key points that I want you to take away from my talk tonight are that nutrients are required for all of life, and what we call reactive nutrients, or nutrients that are available to organisms that live on our planet, are increasing globally. And understanding how these nutrients impact the environment are hard to understand because the way they move around in the environment is complex. And generally, nutrients are not toxic, and streams and rivers can become sick or impaired at very low levels compared to what might be toxic. And I'll tell you a little bit about the sources of nutrients that are coming from beyond the system boundaries, and that has important implications for how we can manage nutrient pollution. So, Who wants to give me a definition of what a nutrient is? Well, it's kind of like a food, exactly. So nutrients are required for life, and they are chemical elements or compounds that organisms need to grow, survive, grow, and reproduce. And in my lab, we study several nutrients, and the ones that we study the most are things like carbon. So what do we need carbon for in organisms? Chemical structures. Do you know what kind of chemical structures? It's in DNA. It's in your bones. It's in your tissues. It's in organic matter. It's in leaves. It's in the food that you eat. Another one that we study is nitrogen. This is a common element that's found in fertilizer. What do we need nitrogen for? Protein, right. Enzymes and proteins contain a lot of nitrogen. So does the molecule chlorophyll, contains a lot of nitrogen. Another important one is also found battery in. There, better?
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So let's think about at a global scale where we might find these nutrients. Give me some examples. Yeah, way in the back. Water. Yes. Where else? Atmosphere, soil. Keen. Ozone. Well, that's part of the atmosphere. Abby. Land. Yeah. So air, rocks, oceans, life on land, and life in the ocean. So let's think about these 5 places, and let's think about carbon. Where do you think we're going to find the most carbon? Rocks. Good answer. So more than 99% of all of the carbon in the world is in rocks. So everything else, all the living creatures, all the carbon dissolved in the ocean, all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you can't even see in this pie chart. How about nitrogen? What do you think about nitrogen? Atmosphere, right. Where else?
Air.
Somebody said atmosphere, so that's air. In the back?
In the water.
In the water. Air and rocks. And everything else you can't see. All right, I'll trick you with phosphorus. Where do you think all the phosphorus is going to be? Rocks. Leaves? Rocks. Water. Soil. So phosphorus, we can start to see where we might find it. Most of it's in soils in the ocean, very little bit in life on land and in the water. And a little bit is in the air as dust, but you can't really see that in that white line. So what do you think this means? If we can barely see where these nutrients are in the living systems of the planet, what does that mean about these elements and compounds that we need for life? Right. Most nutrients are not biologically available. And that's what makes them so interesting to study, because trying to figure out how a plant up in Logan Canyon acquires the elements that it needs to survive becomes an interesting question. So the way that these things become biologically available are highlighted here. The ones that are in gray are processes that happen naturally. So for carbon, plants can use what kind of carbon? Does anybody know? Well, they do photosynthesis, but what kind of carbon do they use? Carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide can come into the environment through chemical weathering and through respiration, so decomposition of already fixed carbon or organic matter. And the way that humans influence the carbon cycle is by burning things, like fossil fuels. So combustion makes carbon become available to the biosphere. Nitrogen, it has a way complicated cycling process. And the natural processes, so most of the nitrogen is in the atmosphere, bound as a triple bond between two atoms of nitrogen. And that's really hard for organisms to break that bond in order to put the nitrogen into protein. But certain bacteria that live alone in the soil or in association with plants or algae can take that nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it into a biological form, and that's called nitrogen fixation. Lightning also can make nitrogen become available. And other than that, once it's in a plant or some other tissue, the only other way to release that for another organism to use is by decomposition. But humans have done some amazing things. In the 1940s, we learned how to make chemical fertilizers from the atmospheric nitrogen. So fertilizer production is important. Nitrogen oxides are also produced when we burn things, so combustion is a source of nitrogen. And last, we've converted many natural landscapes into croplands to grow leguminous crops like soybeans, which have nitrogen fixing bacteria in association with their roots. Phosphorus is mostly found in soils and rocks, and so chemical weathering is the important process that releases phosphorus into an available form. And then through decomposition, that can be recycled. But we also use mining to bring large amounts of phosphorus into the environment that we can use as fertilizer. So let me just show you some of the changes that have happened. This you've probably seen. It's the carbon dioxide concentration measured at Mauna Observatory, which is out in the Pacific Ocean. And you can see when I was born, it was about 320 or so, and now we have approached the 400 part per million world. So there's been a substantial increase in CO2. This is way out in the middle of the ocean. Here's an example from Salt Lake City. So my colleagues at the University of Utah, Jim Elringer and others, have some sensors that are installed downtown on the university campus out in Rose Park. And they've been monitoring CO2 concentrations for the last 14 years. And this graph is from the University of Utah time series. And you can see some pretty interesting things. You can see the overall trend going up. And you can see some mondo spikes going up above 500 parts per million. And that's happening during the winter months, during inversions, when we have little plant uptake because the leaves have fallen. And then we have the cold air pool staying in the valley, and you get these really big spikes of CO2. Here's the human-caused change in nitrogen, and this is kind of a complicated graph, but what it's showing here is the amount of nitrogen that is either produced by fertilizer, leguminous crops, or fossil fuel combustion over the last 150 years or so, 100 years, and the total range of natural nitrogen fixation that would occur in soils and natural plant communities. And these numbers are huge. So let's say we have an average of 150 teragrams of nitrogen that is normally brought from the atmosphere into the biosphere by soil bacteria. Does anybody know how large a teragram is? It's times 10 to the 12th. And the Great Pyramid of Giza, if it was made of nitrogen, would weigh 6 teragrams. And what we have done to the nitrogen in the biosphere is we've doubled it through these processes. So here's the total human input. It is equal to what would occur naturally. So that's equivalent to adding another 27 giant nitrogen pyramids into our biosphere that cycle. We've also increased the amount of phosphorus that we bring into the biosphere, and the best way to measure that is by mining production. And we have quadrupled the amount of phosphorus that is biologically available to the Earth system. So, do you think this is going to be a good or bad thing? Good depends on your perspective. So those are kind of global numbers. What about in Utah? What do you think it looks like in Utah, at least with respect to fertilizer? So this is a picture of the Wasatch Front that I took from Google Earth. And this is showing you over the last, between 1987 and 2001, the amount of fertilizer application on farmlands in red and non-farmlands in blue. And what we've done in Utah is we have increased our nitrogen application by a factor of 6 and our phosphorus application by a factor of 10, but not on farmland, on our lawns in cities. So at households, at churches, at parks, at schools, we have begun to increase our fertilizer application. So Utah's not weird, at least in terms of fertilizers. We're just like every place else in the world. Here's another really complicated graph, and it's showing you one way that these excess nutrients can cause pollution. And let me walk you through this graph. So this first line is showing the total fertilizer application across the 48 contiguous United States. And you can see that it's gone up considerably from 1940 to 1990. This line is showing you the amount of manure applied to landscapes from 1980 to 2000. And these dots are showing you, oops, sorry, I almost blinded somebody, the concentration of nitrate in groundwater. And you might say, well, yeah, there's a lot of scatter. Overall, it is going up. But who cares if there's nitrate in our groundwater? Well, if you look at this scale, this is in milligrams per liter. And this line, this dotted line, is showing you the drinking water standard for nitrate. So any of those wells that fall above that line cannot be used for drinking water. Because I tricked you when I said that nutrients can't be toxic. Nitrate can be toxic above that level. And in particular, it causes a disease called blue baby syndrome. And blue baby syndrome is named that because babies have a smaller body size, and when they drink water that's contaminated with nitrate, they're more susceptible to getting this disease. And the way that it works is it interferes with your body's ability to transport oxygen. Does anybody know what molecule is used for transporting oxygen? Hemoglobin, right. So the medical term for this disease is methymoglominemia. Say that 10 times fast. Come on. Methymoglominemia. And what it does is this hand is showing a white person's skin gets this kind of blue pallor to it because it's not her blood is not transporting as much oxygen. So if you compare this hand with this normal person's hand. It also happens to fish. And in fish, it's called brown blood disease. So these fish are starved for oxygen and become ill. And so above 10 milligrams per liter is when that drinking water threshold is hit because you're more susceptible to this disease. There was a drinking water well in Mendon a few years back that was closed down because it was too high and it exceeded this nitrate standard. So I mentioned fertilizer as a source of nutrients. There are a few others that we study in the research in my lab. One of those is animal and human waste, either as direct inputs or as treated discharge. And also, you can get nutrients coming in through atmospheric deposition, either dissolved in the water or present as dust deposits. And all of these things can impact the water quality. And how much is too much? Well, this graph is showing you some data on different stressors to stream ecosystems that were measured by the EPA's weightable stream assessment. And what you can see, these two at the top are nitrogen and phosphorus. And this means that about 30 to 32% of our streams and rivers in the United States are impaired or are not as healthy as they could be because there is too much nitrogen and phosphorus. And then you can see there are other stressors like sediments, disturbances, habitat for fish, salts, and things like that. But nitrogen and phosphorus are really important stressors in streams and rivers in our country. And I'm going to tell you about one particular river here in Utah, the Jordan River, which is in the middle of Salt Lake Valley. So its watershed is home to almost 1.8 million people. There are 4 wastewater treatment plants that discharge treated sewage treated effluent into the river. And it has a really high concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus. So a milligram per liter of phosphorus is crazy high, and 6.5 or so milligrams per liter of nitrogen. And the ratio of these two elements just happens to be perfect for growing algae. So I'm going to show you a video of what that looks like at the bottom of that river. Isn't that disgusting? That's a big biofilm. And it's a microbial soup that is just growing. And so the way that we might think of how nutrients could impact algae is shown here in this conceptual model, where you get an increase in nitrogen and phosphorus and you start to grow microbes, bacteria, algae, and fungi in the stream. And as that stuff decomposes, you might decrease the oxygen. And if we look at a list of impairments along the Jordan River, so it flows north from Utah Lake through the Salt Lake Valley and discharges into the Great Salt Lake. Despite that those nutrient concentrations are really high, there's not a nutrient impairment described for the river. So up in the upper river, you get temperature, and the dissolved solids, or this kind of the conductivity of the water, become important. So these impairments make it so that it's not good for irrigation or livestock. High temperatures mean, or improper temperatures mean that it's not the right temperature for fisheries. And as you start to get through the middle of Salt Lake Valley, you see things like E. coli, so potential pathogens for humans. And then in the lower river, you get this dissolved oxygen impairment, where sometimes the river can go completely anoxic, but a lot of times in the middle of summer, it'll go below a threshold for fish that makes it so that fish have a hard time acquiring the oxygen that they need. So the state asked my lab group if we could help them figure out this dissolved oxygen problem. And they ran some models for the lower river that showed that if they reduced nitrogen and phosphorus, nothing would happen to the dissolved oxygen. So that link between nutrients and algae and oxygen wasn't working. And when they decreased the amount of organic matter in the river, it would. So they hypothesized that the urban forest, the trees that are planted throughout Salt Lake City, could be an important source of organic matter to this lower river, causing the oxygen impairment. And I thought that was a very interesting hypothesis because it's totally counter to any ecological theory that's related to stream ecology. So let me just do a little bit of a review of how oxygen and organic matter are linked together. So first, somebody mentioned the process photosynthesis, where carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight are used to make organic matter, and a byproduct is oxygen. The reverse process is respiration, where oxygen is used to burn that organic matter, producing water and carbon dioxide. So you see how these two processes can be linked together. And rivers breathe. You can see this happening in rivers. So these are from 2 stations in the Jordan River, just measuring oxygen every 10 minutes or so for a couple of days. And you can see that as the lights come on, the algae start to photosynthesize and produce oxygen, way in excess of what you would expect based on interaction with the atmosphere. And then when the lights go off at night, the oxygen goes back down from respiration. So the way that we wanted to address this question of how this extra organic matter could contribute to the depletion of oxygen in the river, we used a very classical ecological technique called making an organic matter budget. It's like budgeting your bank account, where what comes in has to equal what you spend plus whatever you save in your bank account. So unless you're in a deficit, of course. So we thought about, well, what are the organic matter inputs to that lower river, and what goes out? And is there any accumulation of organic matter in the river? And we did this by measuring certain inputs. So one atmospheric input could be litter fall from the trees that border the river. So we put out some laundry baskets to catch leaves, and they had little signs on them that said, please don't touch, this is a litter fall trap. And you can see that somebody took it literally and put garbage in it. And we found some other stuff in them too, but so we got some input of potential leaves that would fall into the river that way. So that's not a lot of organic matter. Another thing that we did is we used these nets called bedload traps that are seen here. And they're just nets that are anchored to the bottom of the stream. And we deployed them and captured the leaf litter and large organic matter particles that were flowing through the water. That's called coarse particulate organic matter. So stuff that's bigger than a millimeter is considered coarse. And this is kind of what it often looked like. It wasn't always leaves from the urban forest. Here's a big mat of algae and macrophytes. During the spring, we would get lots of seeds falling in. So we found that this coarse particulate organic matter was the lowest proportionally to the lower inputs to the lower river. So it was meeting our stream ecology dogma nicely. We also wanted to measure the organic matter in transport that was smaller than 1 millimeter. So this is my grad student Julie Kelso collecting fine particulate organic matter. This is stuff that gets caught on a filter. It's dead algae cells, bug poop, broken down leaves. And then what passes through the filter is dissolved organic matter. And dissolved organic matter is the stuff that tends to turn water kind of yellowish brown color. So that's the stuff that's dissolved in the water. And we put it all together in kind of a budget context. And before I show you the Jordan River, I want to show you kind of a classic woodland stream in North Carolina where a lot of this kind of previous work has been done. And you just see the arrows that go in. The Jordan River, just look how much larger those arrows are. It is just processing organic matter like crazy. It's getting a lot of material transported in as dissolved organic matter and fine particulate organic matter, and that stuff is fueling the high rates of respiration in the lower river. So it wasn't the urban forest. We saw that this upper portion of the river was the organic matter source, And the lower part of the river was the organic matter sink. So as that steps decompose, it causes the oxygen to go down. So I hope I've been able to show you that nutrients are required for all of life and that their concentrations are increasing in the biosphere. From the Jordan River story, it's kind of an illustration of how complicated it is to link something that's an impairment with nutrients. And the sources of that organic matter are not in the area that's necessarily got the impairment. It was coming in from upstream. So this story is related to this overall statewide study that Ted mentioned. Oh wait, before I get to that, think about what you can do to reduce nutrient inputs to the environment. This one is if you apply fertilizer to your lawn and get it on the sidewalk, use a broom and clean it up. Clean up after your pet. And that's important because all of this stuff flows down to the storm drains, which then go into the river. So this is the new drains to river sign that is it not working?
No.
No. Well, that the USU Water Quality Extension and Natural Resources Student Council sprayed all over campus. If you are outside in the environment, don't poop in the river. Use a groover. And make sure that your plumbing is functional. Here in Logan, a lot of our sewer mains are past their original life expectancy. You can get trees that cause your pipes to break. A lot of them are made out of kind of a cardboard clay kind of thing, and they just fall apart. And that can contribute to pollution of groundwater and surface waters here in our area. Another thing that you might be interested in doing is checking into the programs that this larger statewide project has. It's called Utah, and our mission is to enhance science for Utah's water future. And we have some programs coming up that are for younger folks. We have a research experience for undergraduate program for about 10 or 11 weeks in the summer. It's called the iFellows program. You'll see a couple of our former iFellows downstairs. They're here. You can talk to them about their experience. And applications for this program will typically be due sometime in December or January, depending on when we get them announced. We also have another program called the Summer Research Institute that is designed to provide a 1-week-long research experience for teachers, high school students, and undergraduates. And this will be in Salt Lake City this summer, and applications should come out for that sometime in the spring semester. So it's a good way to learn about our waters and gain a little bit of experience. So with that, I will end my formal presentation and take any questions.